That's great. Well, hi everyone, welcome. That was probably the most important thing to say, and I haven't said that yet. My name's Sarah Gibbon. I'm a co-convener of the Biosocial Birth Cohort Research Network. I'm also convener of UCL's Health, Mind and Society Network, both of which are co-hosting today's event. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you today to this virtual discussion and celebration, I think, really, of this Cambridge University Press Handbook of DOHaD and Society, Past, Present and Future Directions of Biosocial Collaboration, edited by Michelle Pentecost, Giacchini, Tessa Moll and Mickey Penkler. So having been involved as contributor to the handbook and taken part in a discussion event about the handbook in the summer, there's no doubt in my mind that this collection is a vitally important contribution to biosocial research. And I'm so pleased that we have this opportunity to hear from a very diverse group of contributors and discuss the handbook really in this forum. And especially, I think, because so many of the contributors have been involved or are connected to the BBCR network. I'm not going to say too much. I'm going to hand over to the chairs for today, Mickey Penkler and Tessa Moll, who are going to introduce the speakers and just explain the format for the session. Over to you both.
Cool. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share the cover of the book, if everyone can see it. So thank you so much. I'm so excited that we could gather here virtually to discuss this book. Thanks for everyone for joining us, and thanks Sarah and the BBCR and UCL for hosting this event. So my name is Tessa Moll, and along with Michael Penkler and Michelle Pentecost, who's here, and unfortunately Giacchini, who's in Australia and couldn't join us this time. We're the 4 editors of the Handbook of DOHaD and Society, Past, Present, and Future Directions of Biosocial Collaboration. So we're joined today by 5 contributors to the book: Sarah Gibbon, Emily Emmott, Georgia Samaras, Ruth Müller, and Elizabeth Roberts. And I'll invite each of you all to introduce yourselves more fully as you present and discuss your chapters. And we're also here joined by Taylor Riley and Evie Tabor, who have really kindly offered to offer some commentary on the book. So by way of introducing the book, I wanted to share the cover image, which was really important for all of us editors to kind of become the cover art for the book. So this photograph was created with thermography, which is where a thermal camera captures an image using infrared waves rather than the light of a traditional photography. So this is originally developed for military purposes, and the technology here was adapted as a collaboration between the photographer Nicholas Epple and anthropologist Fiona Ross about the first 1,000 days, which is, of course, a public health paradigm emphasizing the developmental significance of the period from conception to age 2. So in the broader suite of photographs from which this cover was drawn, the cover image is drawn from, Epple and Ross sought new ways of depicting social and biological relations that comprise development, autonomy, and caregiving. And they sought, as they write in a paper on it, a way to open up questions about how the hard facts of biology are given force and presence through soft actions of care. And so this image really resonates with the central concern of the book as we kind of imagined it, which traces how folded relations of sociality, interdependence, and biological life play out at one particular site, and that being the field of the developmental origins of health and disease, or DOHaD. So as we know, DOHaD field argues that environmental factors such as nutrition, stress, and toxic exposure all shape health and well-being over extended periods of time. And as well, DOHaD has had a far-reaching impact on understandings of how life experiences and the social contexts in which they occur become embodied, and how the effects of these embodiments are potentially passed on between generations. And so in this handbook, we consider the broad-ranging implications of the DOHaD hypothesis and ways of seeing and thinking that have historically structured its uptake by diverse audiences and publics, and also offering new conceptual apertures through which we might more effectively and equitably harness the insights from this field. So part of the reason it was very important for us to have this particular photo is that it kind of offers a bit of a perceptual reorientation of sorts in relation to the keystone figures of DOHaD analysis, and namely the focus on the pregnant body. So the image offers a route for thinking about care and familial relations and environments without falling into these certain traps. And that is of reproductive sentimentality, highly gendered heteronormative images of the mother-child dyad, and visualized markers of race and class. So in short, the image parallels our aim for the field of DOHaD to better account for the embodied intensities of care, the material environments through which we move, and the imprints that we leave on the earthly services, and that also imprint on us. So the handbook is a product of our authors' patience and conversations, not only across multiple time zones, I can say, but also across the divisions of disciplinary practice, language, and convention. Across 29 chapters, anthropologists, psychologists, physiologists, gender studies scholars, molecular biologists, clinicians, sociologists, epidemiologists, and science and technology studies scholars and legal scholars have all worked towards interdisciplinary legibility as a foundation for generous exchange. So within the 6 sections, we trace the history of the field, unpack the social life of DOHaD, set out a toolkit of critical concepts for biosocial research, explore how DOHaD has moved beyond the lab, and offer case studies for biosocial collaboration, and finally outline current trends and future directions for the field. Held together, the chapters highlight the many contributions that biosocial research in DOHaD can make to furthering health equity. And the relative youth of the field affords opportunities to reshape research practices. And this handbook is set out as both a record of the successes and challenges of this project so far, as well as a toolkit for forging a robust interdisciplinary agenda for transformational research going forward. So here today, as I said, we have the 5 authors who contributed to the handbook, and we're very, very grateful that you could all join us. I'm now going to turn it over to Michi, who's going to be chairing our panelist discussions.
So thank you very much. We have asked each contributor to give like a very short, to speak briefly for 5 to 7 minutes about their contribution to the handbook and their experiences in this collaborative project. And then we'll have the 2 commentaries, and then we'll have open discussion. So I would like to start now and hand over to Ruth Müller to speak about her chapter and contribution. And Ruth actually contributed to 2 chapters in the handbook.
Yes, you did. Hi, everyone. It's very good to see you. Thank you for having me today. Yeah, again, congratulations to the handbook. It's really a massive achievement. So I will speak a little bit about the work that has been going into the handbook. So I have co-authored 2 chapters, one with Martha Kenny, where we're looking at the concept of narrative choreographies, and a second chapter with Michi and Chandni and Mark Hansen, where we've been looking into questions of policy translation of DOHaD and also analyzing different ways in which interdisciplinary groups have been articulating DOHaD knowledge towards policy. I will focus my contribution today mainly on our chapter about narrative choreographies, and want to say a little bit about this question about why I myself and my co-author Martha Kenny think that the way we tell stories about and with DOHaD is really quite essential. So what we're trying to do in this chapter, based on research that we've done in different contexts, some work around adverse childhood experiences and how it is being picked up by people engaged in reform in educational settings, but also in work about epigenetics and specifically about how motherhood and sexuality and also categories like race are being framed in epigenetic and DOHaD research. We're trying to pay attention to how DOHaD connects its knowledge to other forms of knowledge. So which knowledges are being co-articulated in DOHaD research, which possible ways are there to maybe articulate DOHaD with forms of knowledge that foreground issues of social justice, for example. And what might that mean? So we're trying to be pretty concrete. What might that mean for DOHaD scholars, like molecular biologists, epidemiologists, for their own work? And this attention to storytelling for me comes very strongly from feminist SDS context, specifically the work of Donna Haraway and her colleagues, who draw our attention to the fact that the stories that we tell about science and technology really structure in non-trivial ways our possibilities for thinking, for doing research, for that they kind of frame our possibilities to see how things could always also be otherwise, to say it in the words of Susan Lee Starr. And in the DOHaD context, we've seen many stories that focus, and we've already heard this, that focus very strongly on individuals, their so-called lifestyles. We have seen stories that particularly frame bodies in the global south as a possible threat, in a sense, right? We have this kind of notions of the ticking time bombs and in bodies that are perceived to hold developmentally inscribed health risks and threaten through their existence forms of social order, but also forms of kind of distributing wealth in societies. And so with the chapter, we're trying to draw attention to how some DOHaD narratives mobilize highly racialized and also highly sexist existing narratives, and ask the question, what if we articulated DOHaD knowledge with other forms of structural critiques, in a sense? And this kind of articulating with is something that we really saw strongly in our work around adverse childhood experiences in the context of schools in the Pacific Northwest, where actors in education picked up partially highly deterministic and reductionist research on the effect of adverse childhood experiences on the body, but articulated it together with, for example, discourses coming from restorative justice. And through also knowledges coming from fields such as education research or pedagogics or social work. And through these co-articulations, found ways to find non-deterministic readings of this research and use those non-deterministic readings to argue for change within institutions. Yeah, so that's kind of the contribution we've been making in the book. And I think in my experience interacting with the researchers in the DOHaD field, they're quite interested in finding new ways to connect their work to social justice work, to forms of thinking that focus more strongly on structural elements and on systemic questions rather than repeating the same individual-centric move. That often leaves the individual, and often particularly vulnerable individuals, with the responsibility to change their own bodies, the bodies of future generations. Yeah, so I would see this is kind of what we did in the chapter, and I hope this was a somewhat concise account that I can offer up now for discussion.
Thank you so much. That was Professor Ruth Müller from the Technical University of Munich, who co-authored with Martha Kenny the chapter on narrative choreographers, which is chapter 23 in our handbook. If you have questions, I would rather keep them to later to the general discussion, and now have the presentations on the other chapters. And I would now turn to Dr. Emmott, who co-authored the chapter together with Professor Sarah Gibbon, both from the UCL. And this is chapter 20 on understanding child development, a biosocial anthropological approach to early life. Thanks for putting up the slide, Emily. I'm handing over to you.
Sorry, it took me a while to figure out how to unmute myself. Thank you so much for the invite. So I'm Emily. I'm at UCL Anthropology, and I'm Associate Professor in Biological Anthropology here at UCL. And I co-authored this chapter together with Professor Sarah Gibbon, who's hosting this session. So I suspect I'm going to be preaching to the choir a bit here, because obviously there's a bit of a selection effect on who's probably attending this event and also watching this event as a video. But I wanted to give you a really brief overview of the key kind of points that we make in the chapter in the handbook. If I can change that, there you go. So in essence, we're kind of thinking about DOHaD, DOHaD research. There are things that we have to decide as researchers. So what exactly are we going to study? What exposures do we focus on? What data do we collect? And this is kind of the background to the chapter. So, you know, we're kind of approaching this around, you know, do how we study these things depend on how we view early life? And what we wanted to do was explore this from a biosocial anthropological perspective. And I think this is quite a useful thing to bring to the table, given that biosocial is inherently interdisciplinary, kind of bringing in different perspectives, knowledge, frameworks from different disciplines. But also something that anthropology can offer is that we're very cross-cultural. We engage with lots of different types of populations, cultures, and actually I think this is a really important tool in thinking a bit more reflexively about research, DOHaD, what it all means. So that was the kind of background to our chapter. And I think what is often implicitly framed in DOHaD research, not necessarily explicitly, but I think often the implications of DOHaD research is that children are often framed as vulnerable. So the basis is really that environmental exposures impact development in children, which has long-lasting implications for health and later life. So this tends to frame children as immature beings on the pathway to adulthood. And this also frames children as highly sensitive. So there are, you know, things like critical periods, sensitive periods, which is really key for children's development for their future with long-lasting consequences. And this is often framed around science. So I'm coming in, so I'm a scientist in training. I'm kind of coming at this, it is science, but kind of. So this is what we try to untangle a little bit in our chapter. And the one really key thing I want to flag really is that this idea that children are vulnerable isn't a science, you know, isn't like a evidence-based science. It's not a cross-cultural universal concept. So how we view children, how we engage with children really vary across cultures. And in the chapter, we kind of give several examples, but I think one of the more famous anthropological texts is from Margaret Mead, Coming of Age in Samoa. So in this particular book, for example, Margaret Mead describes adolescents and children in 1920s Samoa and what they do. So what she describes is that children are viewed as competent in whatever tasks they're doing. They're given lots of different responsibilities. So it will be older children who have responsibilities of looking after younger children. They're involved and incorporated into society rather than kind of presumed that they can't do certain things. So this idea that children are immature and vulnerable isn't something that is shared. Now you might say, well, that's just, you know, norms, culture, whatever. But, you know, even taking it from, I guess, a more life sciences approach, you know, whether or not you view development as a process of the future is quite a subjective description of childhood. So throughout development, children gain traits, but also lose traits. So for example, I have a 3-year-old. He is right in the middle of believing that he can do anything. And that kind of high level of self-efficacy is something that we observe in 3 to 5-year-olds because there's a function in that particular moment in time. So it's not that he is an incompetent being, therefore he is being, you know, unrealistically viewing himself that he can do everything. But actually it serves a core developmental purpose in that particular time, and therefore, you know, he is perfectly adapted to his age, to that particular environment, and we don't necessarily have to view these characteristics as an immature version of adulthood. And there are some, you know, these are kind of defined concepts in biology, things like ontogenetic adaptations, where there are traits that emerge for particular times in the ontogeny, in the development. And it's not something that is a, you know, like a, I don't want to say a less advanced version of adult traits. So whether or not how we view development and the process of development, I think is something that is really useful to reflect on, because there are consequences to viewing children as vulnerable. So if you view children as vulnerable and immature beings, this brings together expectations around optimal child rearing practices or environments. So often it can encourage involved parenting because children are seen as not being able to do things. You also need to provide developmentally appropriate environments. So one of the examples that we raise in the chapter is how there's guidance to parents to kind of read to children. So rather than involve children in whatever adults are doing, adults have to separate themselves from whatever they're doing to create child appropriate environments. And also there's a lot of focus on protecting children. Now, I think these points that are on the screen, hopefully, aren't necessarily negative, but I think what we need to remember is that there are kind of other side of the coin. So kind of pushing this too much can be potentially harmful. So there is so much literature around the harms of intensive parenting, overparenting, and helicopter parenting for both parents and children in terms of their well-being and their developmental outcomes, but also consequences of excluding children from the adult world can limit how they are able to learn, engage with kind of adult tasks. So you might be limiting their learning. So in terms of the consequences for DOHaD research, which is a kind of key point of the chapter really, is that, so we use the birth cohort studies as an example to kind of think about what impacts does that have. Now, I think something that Ruth already mentioned is that there's a lot of focus on individuals. So in both birth cohort studies, for example, lots of the data focus on parent and household level exposures and not much focus on non-parental caregivers or community level things. And these are really highly important environments or exposures in lots of cross-cultural settings. So this is just a little quote from the actual chapter, which I won't read out. But I mean, these data sets are amazing. They have so much data on so many different things. I cannot believe that using Auspack data, I know exactly when a child first ate a raw carrot. That's absolutely amazing. But I have no idea who is looking after them properly at this type of level, you know, in the early years at all. So there's so much data on parents and children, but often this big gap missing. We are, you know, our society is much more complex, I think. And you know, we have to make decisions around what data we're going to collect. A lot of that can be to do with feasibility. Sometimes it's, you know, whatever the funder decides to fund. But I'm hoping that this chapter inspires a little bit more, I guess, hopefully the chapter inspires a bit more kind of broadening of the horizons, I guess, on how we approach DOHaD research. There's a very ambitious title, I guess, on my slide now. And I really think this idea of nature and nurture is not enough. We need to look at nature, nurture, and culture. And I think culture is so important because it helps us critically reflect on our own cultural norms and assumptions, and also think about what is more, appropriate for other cultures, because different assumptions can lead to different priorities, and that might lead to different types of research. And hopefully this diversification of research can be more inclusive across the world. So that is me. I hope I didn't speak too long. I probably did. But that is it from me. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Emily. Really fascinating. And I think the chapters shows again how nicely the chapters speak to each other. The next speaker is Georgia Samaras from Technical University of Munich. And Georgia has co-authored together with Sophia Rossmann the chapter on doing environments in DOHaD and epigenetics.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you also for inviting me to this very nice event. Really enjoy that we all like that the handbook is out finally and that we can see all the work. So as Michi already said, I co-authored a chapter together with my friend and former colleague Sophia Rossmann, who defended a very exciting and excellent dissertation last week. So also many things to celebrate. So in the focus of our chapter lies on the environment, as we can already recognize from the title, and also, the environment as a notion, as a concept, also as an experience, as something also very elusive, and also how specific underpinnings and understandings of the environment influence biosocial research approaches in practice. And as we all know, and also that as was mentioned in the earlier contributions, environments play a central role in DOHaD research, and therefore it's also we believe very important to consider how scientists measure and also operationalize environments in their research. And this is what we actually also did in our fieldwork and discussed in the chapters. And therefore, we explore how environments are conceptualized and operationalized in the fields of DOHaD and also environmental epigenetics as two highly interconnected fields. We could also say that epigenetics kind of provides the molecular underpinnings that help explain the mechanisms of the central hypothesis of DOHaD. And what we do in our chapter is to critically examine how scientific practices, models, and also methodologies frame the environment as both a measurable and influential factor in health outcomes that most often, as we heard earlier, is conceptualized on rather the individual level and also as a very simplistic factor. For example, in my fieldwork, I noticed often, or I observed experiments with mice where the scientists administered a pharmacological substance to the mouse and then measured the stress response. So a very simplistic idea of experiencing stress. However, as we also know from our fieldwork, this does not mean that DOHaD researchers do not engage in reflections on the complexity of human lives. And Michi also has shown in one of his papers very nicely that these simplistic environments emerge in DOHaD study designs are sometimes also at odds with the researchers and their own normative commitments and aspirations, and also their aim to position themselves against the reductionist science of gene criticism. And it was exactly this dialectic or dilemma between these simplistic or rather simplistic research designs of standard experimentation and also the scientists' critical idea stands towards these experimental arrangements that also kind of was the departing point for our contribution, something that we wanted to analyze and discuss. And therefore, we analyzed our interlocutors' attempts to conceptualize environments in more complex ways and also in ways to include more complexity in the design of the experimental arrangements and research projects in general, which are also very recent developments in DOHaD fields. So this is something that we only in the last years were able to observe and discuss with our interlocutors. But at the same time, also very exciting case studies to explore life science epistemologies. So we specifically ask in our chapter, how can DOHaD research account for the entangled relationship between organisms and environments? And we try to operationalize this question by drawing on two examples we encountered in our ethnographic fieldwork. So Sophia did extensive fieldwork in the domain or research approach of environmental toxicology and discusses how green spaces are negotiated along different dimensions, such as temporal, spatial, and social dimensions, and finally are stabilized as specific measurable variables. Whereas I did fieldwork in the field of neurobiological stress research and discuss how a research group I followed over several months attempts to invite a more complex notion of environment into their mouse model. They, for example, tried to mimic semi-natural environments or also build enriched environments for the mice, for example, by offering them toys or water and food. And therefore, kind of we see how a more complex idea of environment was translated into this new setup. And what we argue in our chapter is that both examples demonstrate that it matters to care for constructing more complex exposure variables and also research arrangements, because these examples illustrate nicely that current developments in DOHaD move away from a historically strong emphasis on only damage-centered research towards environments also with buffering effects, with restorative effects, really also the idea with studying also the positive environments and how they also impinge on our development. And we also show how DOHaD researchers discursively care about acknowledging the dynamic character of environments, with some also moving towards incorporating more complexity into the study designs. But at the same time, most DOHaD researchers also grapple with this complexity as they are still embedded in institutional contexts and also very established infrastructures that do not allow them to put their complex understanding of environments into practice. So therefore, we conclude our chapter by proposing that interdisciplinary collaborations, even when situated in divergent research ecologies, might prove fruitful to further discussions on doing environments in practice. We suggest several reflections. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but these reflections we hope serve for, help to account for the different epistemological and also socio-political dimensions environments are made up of in DOHaD research. And so with our essay, we, in a nutshell, wish to emphasize the necessity to acknowledge doing environments as a concrete research practice and also as a repertoire in scientific discourse, instead of leaving this very central scientific task undiscussed. So we have to make it visible and also discuss how we do environments in research. And DOHaD researchers could, for example, take into account environments that are beneficial to organisms instead of leaving this undiscussed to their research projects, and which we think is also a great opportunity to go beyond individualized and damage-centered narratives in DOHaD and also tell other, like different scientific stories that account for the complexity of biosocial worlds.
Thank you so much, Georgia. Next speaker is Elizabeth Roberts from the University of Michigan, and Liz was lead author on chapter 15 on bioethnography.
Hi, everyone. It's really good to see you. And just quickly, how long should we speak for? About 5 minutes or what?
5 to 7 minutes. Yeah.
7 minutes. Okay. Sorry, I was late. Somehow I had a Microsoft Teams link and I was sitting in the waiting room waiting for someone to let me in. Before I talk a little bit about the chapter, I just want to again thank the organizers for having my team be part of this. It was a terrific process, and I just also want to say how cool I thought it was that you all organized this system for giving each other feedback during the process, which I hadn't really experienced in edited volumes before. And so I think the whole model for how the project was done taught me a lot and led to a really terrific volume. So thank you for that. I guess I don't think I want to go super into detail about the chapter as much as talk about sort of the impetus behind the chapter, and maybe some of the behind the scenes stuff that happens in the kind of work I do with these environmental health scientists that feels relevant for our conversation today. So for the last, I think it's now 13 years, I'm a medical anthropologist, and I collaborate with environmental health scientists, toxicologists, environmental engineers, more recently economists, which is pretty interesting, and political scientists, through work on an environmental health birth cohort study in Mexico City called Emmott. There's actually two birth cohorts. One's called Emmott and one is called Progress, and they're highly connected. And one of my key collaborators is the in-country PI, the Mexican PI for both of those birth cohort studies. And we're really sad she can't be here today. Her name's Samara Rojo. And so she is an epidemiologist and a mathematician, and I co-authored the article with her and then a group of other researchers that have been part of the various kinds of bioethnographic projects that we've done together over the last 10 years. And so no one else on the author list is an anthropologist. There's a biostatistician, there's an epigeneticist, there's a sociologist who works on various kinds of buffering processes in the human body in a school of public health. I'm trying to remember, and then there's an epidemiological nutritionist. And so I've worked with all of them in kind of large scale and small scale projects for the last few years. And when I was asked to submit or to be part of this and asked specifically to talk about bioethnography, what I wanted to do and what the team wanted to do was to write more of a methodological piece on how we've been doing it, because the how of this often, I think, seems very complex, and it is very complex, because I think there's a lot of ways that doing truly multidisciplinary research, I mean, just there's a lot of, I guess, barriers, to use a really generic and kind of wishy-washy term, to what makes it hard to do this kind of research. So the way we start out the paper is by talking about two of the kind of main challenges or things that get in the way of potentially creating really robust DOHaD research or any kind of developmental or life science research about the life course. And one of them is the kind of reductionism that life scientists tend to engage in, that also tends to focus on individuals. And then the fact that most researchers in the life sciences, or anyone who's doing this kind of research, tend to come from high resource settings. And so their sense of what kinds of questions to ask or what the questions are very much shaped by that. And that's a kind of framing that I've come to over the years of working with researchers in the life sciences as a way to kind of lay out some of the challenges without making it be about them and their ideas about the research they want to do. And what I mean by that is that I think in these kind of collaborative processes, it can be pretty easy as an anthropologist to come with critiques about how life science research is done. But then once you start trying to collaborate, you see, in the way that we see with any group that an anthropologist is studying, this idea that there is ideas in people's heads, and if we can just talk about it, then we could get over it and move on and do something else, is really not how things work at all. And that there is a really different ecologies with material conditions that make it that really much shape how people do what they do, whether they're scientists or, I don't know, a disenfranchised group that is the object of birth cohort studies. And so for me, the work over the last 13 years has been to see that very much like what Georgia was saying, life science researchers, people who are thinking about environmental health, often have really complex ideas about what the environment is, what objectivity is, how you gather data. But there are all kinds of structures that make it that they have to do the research in a particular way. And those in the United States, I would say the most important structure is the way funding happens. And funding in the United States is shaped by the National Institute of Health. And the National Institute of Health pretty much demands, if you're doing large scale birth cohort research or any kind of research that we would think of in terms of, I don't know, group under DOHaD, to get the kind of the large scale funding that you need to do that research, you need to come up with very, very strict, narrow hypotheses that you're gonna kind of carry out through specific aims. And that produces the reductionism. And that is the only way researchers can get ahead, get promoted, is if they get these kinds of grants. And it is the only way that they can get the funds, basically, to do the kind of research they want to do. So even when they are attuned or interested in doing a different kind of research, it is incredibly difficult to do so. And the way we've been successful so far is I tend to bring research funds from other places, like the National Science Foundation in the United States, where you don't have to do hypothesis-based work. And that allows us to do these much smaller scale things where we develop more of an ethnographic sense of what's going on that then hopefully later can be kind of scaled up, and in the reductionist way that kind of research is going to be scaled up. But in many ways, we arrived at the questions, we arrived at the hypothesis through a very intensive kind of ethnographic grounding. And I would say that's the main thing that I'm kind of trying to work on with these scientists, that showing them that if you work with a very open-ended a very open-ended stage, a non-hypothesis driven stage early on, you end up coming across new research areas and asking really radically different questions than you would have asked if you didn't do that kind of work. And so the chapter basically covers that process with a few examples. And the examples are about some work we've done in combining ethnographic research and nutritional epidemiology, and then combining research on household water infrastructure and ethnography, and how we were then able to take that study and scale it up to a national health census in Mexico with 10,000 households. That's a nationally representative study or census in Mexico that basically showed my collaborators that you can start asking questions that they never thought to ask and come up with some pretty revelatory findings. So that's been the kind of proof of concept of working with them. And then the last two parts of the chapter, one is about thinking about how you can combine ethnography with kind of innovative forms of statistical modeling. And the biostatistician that we work with, this has been the main reason she's hung around for 10 years, is to figure out how we can do the ethnographic work that allows for multi-dimensional forms of statistical modeling and get a causality in the way that statisticians usually can't do. And that's been a really slow process, but we're starting to have some interesting results, and maybe I can talk about them in the Q&A if anyone's interested. And then the last part of the essay, which is, it feels like it's the last part of every single essay I wrote like this, is what are the challenges? And that's where, again, we go over all the ways that the different research ecologies we inhabit really work against this kind of research, and you know, the little workarounds we've found around it, but that the true capacity for the social sciences to integrate is going to be kind of held up until I think some of the funding models work pretty differently. And given the state of the United States right now, I don't see that happening anytime soon. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Liz. Last but not least, we have Professor Sarah Richardson from Harvard University, and she has authored the chapter on cryptic causality.
Thank you so much. First of all, I also want to thank the editors and all the authors in the volume. I have benefited so much from your research, from the community that you have cultivated over the years, the many ways we've come together, and I see this as just one new iteration in all of that work. And to the editors, you've always attended to trying to cultivate community in a way that translates to scientific practice. And I see that in this volume and the many different voices that you've brought in. I took the opportunity and invitation to contribute to the volume to extend a concept from my book, The Maternal Imprint, the contested science of maternal fetal effects, which was causal crypticity. And I'm glad that you put it as a key concept for biosocial research. I'm not sure it is. I would like it to be, but certainly causality is. Causality has been a persistent dilemma for DOHaD research. And in my book, I write about that historically. So even before there was DOHaD, there was lots of speculation about early life effects, how to measure them and how to know them. And these causal dilemmas recur in new formations and have characterized the field since its inception. And I really try to trace that as it is intertwined with other threads in the history of maternal fetal science, or rather any sort of speculation about the long-term or permanent effects of experiences or exposures in the womb. So in the book, I look at several threads or several tensions around this research. One, of course, is discourses about maternal agency and responsibility for reproductive outcomes. Second is the progressive anti-genetic determinist constructs of the biosocial body as they have positioned themselves around the maternal-fetal relation. And the third is this persistent and unresolved question about the limits of empirical science in confirming the causal effects of intrauterine perturbations on disease distribution in human populations. And what I tried to argue there is that this seemingly epistemic dimension, this third part, can't really be pulled apart from the other two. Like gender matters to how causality is constructed in this field, and the relative permissiveness that we have about claims making around predictive, intervenable, consistent effects in this field. So I was very excited about that in the book, and then very excited to have the chance to extend that concept here. Needless to say, DOHaD scientists are quite aware of these causal dilemmas. There are many ways in which the field itself has become a site for innovating, and I think Liz was just talking about that, for innovating models for grappling with tough causal questions. And there have been fierce criticism of DOHaD research for it making assertions that are not plausible, not stable in certain conventional ways, don't replicate across different populations, and have small effect sizes. So I take several approaches to understanding causal crypticity in the book and more developed in the chapter, which kind of can serve as a standalone for thinking about this concept. So I think that high tolerance for what I call causal crypticity, which refers to the context specificity and complexity of causal attributions in DOHaD science, can be defined as a field-defining epistemic norm that accepts a persistent state of indeterminacy about the empirical reality, strength, and magnitude of hypothesized causal phenomena that are the object of study. And I argue that causal crypticity can be understood in three ways, therefore: as an epistemic norm, as a boundary delimiting signature of field culture or epistemic style, and as a promissory mode. And so I think we have to think of it not just as a set of statistical questions about how to establish causality, but as a way of making arguments and clearing space for doing certain kinds of work. And I think that contending with causal crypticity as a norm-shaping feature of the knowledge landscape of maternal fetal effects science demands reflection on strategies for ethical and accountable practices of claims making in this area of science in a world where its findings are received as carrying social implications in arenas ranging from reproductive autonomy to attempts to address the health implications of racism and intergenerational trauma. So I work through a couple of examples of cryptic effects and cryptic and causal crypticity in the chapter. And then I sort of say, you know what, DOHaD is interesting too, because in exhibiting, in sort of being at the forefront of exhibiting this feature of causal crypticity, it's helping us think more broadly about the post-genomic life sciences in general. Some have argued that the biosocial is really the platform for post-genomic life sciences. And I'm saying it's not just about the topics studied, but it's about the epistemic styles and ways of claims making that are being forged in DOHaD. And anyone who's interested in what's happening with these fields that use data-rich, complex biosocial causal spaces in many areas of post-genomic biomedicine, could look to DOHaD and its practices and its grappling with these issues as an index of these characteristics of our contemporary biomedical life science sort of epistemic landscape. And in these many areas of post-genomic biomedicine, this is what I would posit. Causal claims are actually not expected to result from investigations. And it is expected that the strength of findings will vary depending on contextual factors. It's expected that findings won't replicate across multiple data sets. And there is a new tolerance for a certain permissiveness with implying the likely causality of observed correlations as just part of the norms of biomedicine. And that might be a feature of these data-rich environments. And we can say that there are many contexts for these shifts. Certainly the bigness of the data. I loved the point that Emily brought out about the year or age at which a raw carrot was first eaten by a child as being one of those crazy data points. So we have going to have a lot of correlations in these big data environments between biological and social outcomes. And while these correlations themselves may not support causal inference, causal crypticity enables a sort of presumption of the likelihood of causality. And findings are narrated, to use Ruth's framework, within a larger frame that implies a strong assumption that such correlations, summed in their entirety, are evidence supporting an intuition of causality. And this shift in epistemic norms sort of collapses 20th century oppositional distinctions between the complexity affirming dissident or genetic determinist sciences and the reductionist and determinate or anti-genetic determinist sciences on the one hand, and the reductionist and determinist ones on the other hand. So I'm actually interested in how causal crypticity is an epistemic norm that aligns with certain speculative and promissory modes of today's transnational big data crunching science, which promises to mine previously undetected patterns across populations, unlocking a key to who we are and where we are going in our uncertain era of demographic transformation, technological change, and environmental crisis. So I am interested in the ways in which subtle effect sizes and complex confounding that are typical of causal claims in DOHaD science are not simply an everyday causal challenge, but rather function as a defining epistemic norm of the field and a future-oriented social discourse. And I offer the concept of causal crypticity to direct attention to the links between causal crypticity as an epistemic norm, the production of risk categories, and the promissory hype cycle of science. And I think there is a way in which grappling with or even embracing this feature of DOHaD research could make DOHaD a laboratory for thinking about causal crypticity in a reflective and forthcoming manner. And this includes, of course, these efforts to strengthen causal frameworks for making inferences in the face of causal crypticity, as some already are. But it also includes practices such as rigorously placing risk claims emerging from such sciences in context, in particular through collaboration with social scientists exploring the sociocultural dimensions of health and life course development, as we've heard about today. And also accurately characterizing the degree of uncertainty in scientific findings in this area, and educating consumers of such science in the features of reasoning in a field defined by causal crypticity. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to see how same themes resonate throughout these chapters and how nice the chapters speak to each other. And these are just 5 chapters of the 29 wonderful chapters that we have assembled in the handbook. And it's also nice to see that there are more contributors to the handbook also in the audience, like, for example, Tatiana Buklias. Yes, so we have 2 more commentaries of also 5 to 7 minutes. Dr. Evie Tabor and Dr. Taylor Riley have very generously agreed to give a commentaries to the handbook. And we'll go first with Taylor, please.
Great. Thanks so much. Can everybody hear me? Right. Okay. Well, you know, I'll be commenting as somebody who's not contributed to the handbook, but just read through bits of it, read the introduction, the massive table of contents, which is a huge feat in itself, and a chapter that was really useful to my own research. So I'll just talk about a few of those things, at risk of echoing a lot of what's already been said. But I'll start with just a huge congratulations to Michelle, Michael, to Tessa, as well as Jaya, who's not here. This is just such a huge achievement. The volume itself is huge, you know, praising it as it being momentous, but also in terms of size, it's a very large handbook. And when I was at one of the launches of the handbook at the 4S conference in Amsterdam, I was really struck by how many people I knew of featured in the book from such a wide variety of disciplinary backgrounds. It's not something that happens to me very often as an early career researcher, that I can see all of these names sort of projected and in the table of contents that I know from wildly different contexts. So that was really exciting and refreshing for me. I'm a medical anthropologist, and so I have to admit that when it comes to DOHaD, I'm more of a sort of semi-critical observer. I'm at an arm's length distance from DOHaD. But because of that, what's really refreshing to me about the handbook is its careful attention to nuanced critiques of both DOHaD research, but also the essence of what DOHaD is. So including what it's assumed to be, what it can and cannot do, what it glosses over and hides from view at times. And from what I've read of the handbook, I think it does this really successfully at the same time as it delves deep into the ongoing enactment of DOHaD as a vital category of research. And I think that's pivotal to the breadth as well as the depth of the book, and really speaks to its holism as well as its length. When I noted down my thoughts on the introduction chapter, I actually picked up the exact same excerpts that Tessa has already read, so I'm not going to repeat those, but instead I'll sort of re-emphasize the importance of the critique that follows that introduction that Tessa gave which is namely that, quote, in honing attention on pregnancy and early life, DOHaD research has at times overemphasized the maternal-fetal relation to a concerning degree, stripping it of context and obscuring the distributed relations through which pregnancy, birth, and child rearing proceed, end quote. This is something that's given attention throughout the book, including in Sarah and Emily's chapter that Emily delved into earlier. And so as Tessa said, the notion of new conceptual apertures through which we might more effectively and equitably harness the insights of this field guides the handbook's imperative of broad explanation and in-depth critique. Conceptual apertures is, I think, a salient reference to that image on the book's cover, which the introduction leads with, and which serves as a sort of red thread throughout these diverse chapters. Something that was especially valuable to unpacking my own qualitative data on placenta donation to the Alspac birth cohort was in section 2, so the social life of DOHaD, section 2's 5th chapter, the promise and treachery of nutrition in DOHaD, science, biopolitics, and gender. So in that chapter, Vivienne Moore and Megan Warren show how DOHaD research can be, quote, inevitably reductionist through the emphasis on identifying mechanisms and insisting that causation is only convincingly demonstrated by the experimental manipulation of specific factors, where, for example, studies need to simultaneously provide the proof that maternal nutrition has effects on fetal growth and development in disregard of the relevance of social circumstances and structural factors. So Moore and Warren add that not only has this logic directed vast attention to the physiology and later epigenetics of the fetus and the placenta, which is also incredibly important, but it has heavily influenced ideas about how to respond to nutrition as a cause of poor health. And I think that tension that the authors present in that chapter is at the heart of the work that many of us do and aspire to do, right? To respond to questions of how do the politics of a given scientific logic of the body, its faculties and realities, help, and how do they harm? What do they reveal and what do they conceal? And then, of course, there's the work of actually doing something with our answers to those questions. So as I was reflecting on all that, I wanted to come up with some food for thought questions, and it's really hard for me to come up with any that the handbook hasn't already sort of posed in its content. But I would love it if any of the authors or anyone in general would like to speak to questions of, for example, to what extent can or will contemporary DOHaD-based interventions shift their focus away from individual responsibility entirely? And also, what is the future of DOHaD? Will we still be using the DOHaD acronym in another 50 years? Or will we abandon it for something like SOHaD, Structural Origins of Health and Disease? I don't know why or why not. Those are questions that sort of linger with me as I think about the handbook and the work of the individual chapters, which as yet I've only been able to sample a small portion of, but I look forward to reading more. And thank you all again for your contributions, and really grateful to be here.
Thank you so much, Taylor, for your nice commentary. Next is Dr. Evie Tabor with the second commentary.
Hello, nice to see you all. And thank you so much for allowing me to comment on this book. It's been a real privilege to have the opportunity. And I would definitely echo Taylor's praise of the book and the congratulations on the achievement. It's really extraordinary. And I think particularly I was particularly drawn to the huge disciplinary and geographical scope. And particularly that throughout the continued attention to feminist and social justice perspectives was incredibly valuable, and particularly the inclusion of disability studies, Indigenous perspectives, and inclusion of economics and the legal perspectives which I think are often left out of these conversations, and particularly the economic and legal perspective are ones that I had not even thought of as relevant, and yet they were so insightful into the value and sort of the different dimensions of DOHaD as a framework. I was also struck, and I think this has sort of been echoed a little bit, particularly is the sort of the unity and cohesiveness of it, despite this sort of huge range of responses, different disciplines, etc., and the degree to which the chapters spoke to each other. I had, again, like Taylor, I didn't manage to read the whole thing, even though I'm definitely going to spend a good deal of time finishing it, but I was able to read sort of a fair chunk of the chapters, and it was extraordinary how to the degree to which they really spoke to each other. Just to sort of position myself, I sort of have a background in medical anthropology, but currently I work in statistical, like social epidemiology, which is a big transition, but it is really interesting coming to this book from the perspective of working with people who are much more on that sort of statistical methodological approach to DOHaD and things like that. And I also work a little bit in policy impact and research communication. So again, the reflections and the thoughts around how these sort of concepts are being introduced into policy were really relevant to things I'm thinking about and things I know my colleagues are thinking about. I wanted to sort of pull out 2 to 3 things I think spoke to each other, and I think really reflect what other people have spoken about as well. And that sort of first one was around this conversation we're having around where blame and responsibility are sort of apportioned, and the sort of absolution of responsibility that is often sort of allowed to happen from sort of larger systems like environmental, political, etc. But then also, as a number of people have reflected, the way in which that is a conversation that's happening within the field as well, that researchers themselves are reflecting and engaging with this topic, but the ways in which their sort of institutional structural things prevent that engagement to be very readily seen. And I was interested by the conversation around funding, but I also think sometimes something that's a little bit underappreciated is the role of things like journals and expectations, particularly around engagement with policy. There was a really interesting chapter around how scientists talk about their sort of the interventions and points of intervention, but actually, and some of that I think is extremely valid in terms of the thinking about the sort of different ways of demands, but also thinking about the demands on researchers to make those kinds of policy intervention claims that are not necessarily things that people are trained to do and things like that, but also a little bit of hedging of bets in terms of trying to talk to a policy or impact audience with sort of practical suggestions, if that makes any sense. And I think sometimes that can limit the imagination of the things that are being suggested, or at least the things that are being sort of focused on. But I found that really interesting. And I was also just sort of alongside that thinking about, again, something that comes up in a couple of the chapters and also in Sarah's chapter on causality and things like that, is this sort of the histories of this idea of sort of magic bullets within science, that there are these sort of, and I went to a talk in a cardiology department very recently, and which was a population health talk, so essentially saying, has life course population health failed because we haven't identified any more big interventions, things like smoking or cholera interventions, lead, these kinds of things, and this idea that there's these things that are out there to be found, but there's a sort of a methodological or philosophical or sort of theoretical failing that isn't finding these things, but actually this reflection of the ways in which actually maybe that's the answer, is that actually in reality there's more kind of this focus on the sort of the more sort of what's the word, kind of opaque and elusiveness of actually these these pathways of causality and things like that are actually potentially the thing that's sort of being sought but not found. And again, I think that framing of something as something that is to be potentially celebrated in many ways actually represents a more complex, more nuanced engagement with these factors. But yes, and just finally, just the ways in which I think that informs these conversations around impact and policy engagement, in that if there's potentially a fear that if these sort of studies can't produce these magic bullets, that the conversations with policymakers, politicians, etc., get harder when actually the solutions are, as we all know, complex and take a long time and these kinds of things, and the ways in which that pushes and pulls against researchers and the wider environment of trying to have these conversations. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the commentaries, and thank you also for all the speakers and for all this valuable input. We have only 15 minutes left of discussion, and I would like to open it up to a general discussion, but maybe start it off with the question. We've heard a lot about the kind of challenges that the field faces, but also what kind of potentials it has. And so my question to the contributors would be, what do you think is next up for DOHaD? So what are the gaps in the field? Where should it head to? And yeah, what's also the future, perhaps also the future for biosocial collaboration between social scientists, humanities scholars, and DOHaD researchers? Does anybody want to take up this daunting question from mine?
Michi, I might just jump in, just first of all to say, a huge thank you to everyone for attending, and it's just also really wonderful to connect, once this thing is in the world. And we're doing this in various forums, and because there's 29 chapters, not everyone's always available for one event. So it's great. We can have multiple events with this wonderful group of friends that we've made in the course of producing this. So that's really wonderful. And thank you very much to Taylor and Evie for your commentaries. And I thought Michi's question about the future of DOHaD, Taylor also had a question around that. So I thought I'll just put one little thing in the pot there, which seems to be coming up in my conversations with DOHaD researchers, which is that they are really frustrated with this individual structural binary. And I think the commercial determinants of DOHaD is on the horizon as a form of interest or a topic of interest, given that the commercial determinants of health is about to kind of explode next year with the big Lancet commission, and the WHO is very focused on it. So yeah, you heard it here first. The commercial determinants of DOHaD is the future of DOHaD. But I see Ruth has her hand up, so I'll be quiet.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you everyone for this great discussion. I'm actually going to piggyback on something that came up. Michi was here in Munich last week and gave an absolutely wonderful talk about his habilitation project that very much focuses on this question: where has DOHaD been? Where is it now? Where is it going into the future? And we had a great colleague here from the medical school, Clarissa Parceres da Costa, who is a psychologist, and she brought up this really interesting point, that for her, some of the most convincing evidence for the DOHaD hypothesis comes actually from research into allergies, and specifically a study here in Bavaria on how farm dust has effects on farm dust that is inhaled by mothers during pregnancies has effects on future health outcomes in the children in terms of allergies. And we then had a really interesting discussion that I want to share here with you about why DOHaD is in many ways so strongly linked to thinking about kind of the diseases that are so hyped in the media, right? Obesity, cardiovascular disease, all of diabetes. And so my question, and that are extremely multifactorial, right? So it would be very interesting to have a better sense of why DOHaD focuses on these specific diseases, and maybe how also being focused so strongly on these kinds of hyped diseases affects what DOHaD can do and can't do. So I just wanted to share this discussion that we had because I thought it was really fruitful, and this question could be interesting for DOHaD going forward.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I have Liz and then Tatiana, please.
Evie and Taylor, thanks so much for your commentary, and it's really nice to see you again. It's been a little while. Good to see you on the screen. The question of like what's next for DOHaD, I have no idea because I don't feel like yeah, I think I can talk more about biosocial research, I guess. And I'm thinking about my collaborators as do they even think of themselves as DOHaD researchers? And I guess maybe they do, but what Michelle brought up about the commercial determinants, that really does seem like that's a thing that's on the rise. And it within the environmental health worlds that I operate in, or the nutritional epidemiology worlds I operate in, and it feels like a potential real bridge to, of course, talk about, capitalism in certain ways, or I mean, that's a goofy big word, but, the ways that regulation and lack of regulation shape what people can eat and how they eat it. The thing that feels like it's kind of an obvious swipe, but that it's like the work that we have as social scientists or historians of scientists is to point out again that with commercial determinants, they're again sticking with the word determinant. And that is so, that is just, it's like that word is, I don't think it shuts down fully the thinking of the scientists. Like they do know it's really, there's a lot of things going on and it isn't just one thing, but the way that social determinants or commercial determinants, like, okay, now we're just going to go do this thing. And that's what the funding mechanism is going to allow. And we're, and it would just, I feel like a lot of us, the work we're doing is to try to jiggle that and trouble the word, what determinism is, but that's pretty pervasive. And then I guess I just wanted to offer one thing that another team of I&R have been playing around with that kind of tries to use the language of big data and stuff that comes out of exposomics, which we can critique these things in all kinds of ways, but a way that this group of Mara's part of this too, and we're thinking about different methods for understanding what exposures are and just what models of exposures are. And the term we've been trying to take up to talk to people in the life sciences or who make numbers is that what this open-ended stuff we do, ethnography or anything where you're not deciding in advance what the question is we're doing non-targeted analysis, which resonates with at least toxicologists who get really excited about the capacity of big data, like large language, anyways, AI and big data things, to be able to look at a vast array of things and then try to understand connection. And we've been calling ethnography non-targeted analysis, and that seems to that gets us a little bit farther. And I'm all about these practicalities of like what can make it so that we can keep trying to get away from determinism and so non-targeted analysis, I'm sure it's going to end up being as flawed as anything else, but it's kind of working for now in certain circles to help the scientists understand what it is that we're offering.
Thank you, Tatiana.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. And luckily it was only 6 a.m. in New Zealand and not 3 a.m. like in Australia, so I could just about make it. I actually just wanted to reflect primarily on Emily's comment about the kind of need to include culture, and I think a few other people's I think kind of everybody talking about reductionism, individualism, and I actually want to kind of from a point of view of historian to say that DOHaD was meant to be about individuals, right? DOHaD is a child of the 1990s. It emerged in it was created in 1989 and 1990. It had an almost immediate social policy impact. It really was very fast. It was picked up by New Labour, and the sort of UK New Labour was really big on policy innovation, but it was picked up because it fitted into neoliberal economics, right? It was not a kind of broad intervention into people's environments like the kind of welfare state of Keynesian economy up to the 80s. It was meant to be to fit into a policy of the state where the state provides a basic safety net and the rest is individual.
I think we've lost Tatiana.
I don't know. So
Tatiana, sorry,
yeah.
we lost you for the last 5 seconds or 10 seconds.
Yeah, I said, I
I
have very unstable network for some reason. I said I don't know how we make it into something it was not meant to be to start with. So this is just a comment from a historical point of view. Thanks.
Thank you, Tatiana. My immediate response would be, I don't know if DOHaD was just one thing from the beginning, right? It very quickly was affiliated with quite different agendas, I think, at least from my perspective, or what I learned about the history of DOHaD. So I think, yes, it fitted very well into this neoliberal agenda in the 1990s. But then again, from the beginning, it also had like these stresses on social determinants, on so I think these tensions between like an individual and a more structural translation of DOHaD might have been there from the beginning. So I think, I don't know if it's about making it into something which it wasn't from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was always a tension what researchers wanted to do and what policymakers wanted the research to be and where it kind of fit. But I think it was quite interesting how quickly it became part of social policy and how well it fitted into certain way that the state was seen and what the state could do for people and which parts were then picked up. Yeah.
And I agree, and I think what several of the chapters that were discussed today also showed that there was always a tension between what researchers wanted to do and what the kind of structures and systems in which they operated allowed them and afforded them to do, right? This is like a big tension. So I mean, many DOHaD researchers I've worked with also really struggling with this tension between the kind of aspirations that they have and the kind of reductionisms that they do in the work because of the kind of structures in which they operate. Tessa, please.
Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to get the little yellow hand going. Thank you, everyone. This has been a real privilege to also have everyone here. So I just want to reiterate my gratitude again. I guess I might be actually asking the final question then. But I kind of wanted to hear, like, I think that the handbook was written with this like promise of, the impetus to kind of take this moment of DOHaD and think of how we can make real inroads in changing research infrastructures and ecologies as well. I wanted to kind of ask for those who are working in those kind of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary environments, like, on a very kind of more pragmatic level, how do those things actually get off the ground? I mean, we've talked a lot about challenges, of course, with like funding and the ways that universities operate in different contexts. But yeah, from people's different experiences, if they could outline how those projects do get started.
Well, this is a bit of a leap, but I have created an interdisciplinary research lab called the Gender Sci Lab. And the model that I have used is that of the lab and is a training environment. And so what I've learned from that is there are many people interested in training in doing this work, many students, many graduate students or early career researchers who need spaces to develop the skills. And it's a slow practice, as we know, of dialogue across fields and learning each other's languages. And so what I've learned from that experience or observed is that providing these opportunities for early training experiences, literally sitting at the border between disciplines and translating between them, can be very powerful, especially if it is really immersive learning methods and writing and researching together. So that's led me to think that training grants, the kinds of materials maybe you provided here, rolling them into pedagogical efforts or modules for training across the biomedical and social sciences, to seed a new generation who can lead these projects and translate between fields. So that's a leap from, I don't consider myself a DOHaD researcher, but I'm curious about exactly what you said, which is what is the way to set these up? And again, I'll emphasize the slowness. People need, you don't do this in one session or with one reading. You have to sit together and work together and write together over an extended period of time. And it's a process-based way of learning. So I often think and wonder and find myself in environments like this advocating for how can we create those infrastructures, spaces, opportunities, particularly for early career, although there are people in every stage of career who could use retraining or the opportunity to slow down and do that kind of thinking.
Okay, I see Liz.
Just to echo some of what Sarah said about the slowness, that has very much been my experience of having the different kinds of collaborations I've been part of it take a lot of time, and that slowness is actually quite challenging, again, for anyone that you're working with in the life sciences. Like, I mean, it's excruciating, and it isn't possible often for some of the early career scholars in the life sciences or in the applied sciences, they call themselves, like in public health. So just to kind of, I don't know, note a few things. I think there's an interesting set of discussions that could be had about the way that we probably need both people who work on multidisciplinary teams that are trained really well in whatever they do, and also potentially maybe are a little farther along and are well ensconced in their fields and so can take the risk of collaborating outward. And then we need the people that come to be trained within more than one field. And I think, I mean, Sarah's lab at Harvard is amazing. You should all go visit it. And what Sarah Gibbon and others have created at UCL with the SOC-B program also seems really exemplary. And for many years, I had a lab training undergrads in working with ethnographic materials for part of this larger project. And it was a wonderful thing to see that several of the students I worked with closely in there have gone into being able to be these kinds of bridges and translators in projects that they've done with me, but then they've gone on and done that elsewhere. But what Sarah said, like the slowness of that is pretty astonishing, and it doesn't match the time frame of most people in the life sciences, especially if they're trying to get tenure or anything like that. And I mean, it is this ongoing funny topic. And then I guess I would just say again that the way that I've been able to do any of this with life scientists or numbers makers is I had to bring my own funding, at least at the beginning. And now more I'm being put on grants as they can see, oh, this can be worth it. to do this weird thing. And there's been more proof of concept, but having one's own funding sources and being able to go do the thing that I'm saying we should do together with material that they care about or with groups they care about has been the main thing that got me on the door. And then the slowness of being able to stick around. I had tenure. I didn't need to publish something right away, and so that also has really helped. And I mean, and Sarah's heard me talk about this a lot with Mara, we just really liked each other. So we were able to kind of deal with the ups, but also there has been many, many downs. I mean, I could go on forever about all the kind of really bad things that have happened that we've been able to weather because we actually did like each other. And that is another part of it.
Thank you for ending on that. It just reminds me as well, just as like social scientists and ethnographers, how this kind of work draws on personal and professional skills areas of our lives at all times, which I think is fitting for also the topic at hand. So I think we are at time now, but I just want to again thank very genuinely all of our speakers and contributors and commentators. It's been, I'm sitting in Cape Town, very far away from lots of you. So it's been a real privilege to kind of gather around to talk about the book this evening. Or in my evening, wherever you may be time of day. So thank you again so much for joining us. And please read and share the book. And yeah, have a lovely day further.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks again
Thank
for the
you.
book and for organizing this.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Nice to see all
Sarah.
of you in one place.
Great to be
discussing
with you.